This is Bible School Radio, KDKR, Decatur, Dallas, Fort Worth, KYJC, Commerce, and KMWC, Bethany. Portions of KDKR programming do not necessarily reflect the views of this station, its management, or staff.
Prudent Money with Bob Brooks is sponsored by the Prudent Money Foundation on 91.3.
Well, what do you need to know about the IRS? Today we're going to take a look. Stay tuned for Prudent Money. Good afternoon, this is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Well, probably the best book, in my opinion at least, written on dealing with the IRS, which is called the IRS Problem Solver, turns 20 this year. Today we're talking about that book and going back to some basics. The author and IRS expert Dan Pilla, who's here with us every month to share insights on the IRS, is here with me today to give us some thoughts on a great book. Dan, welcome to Prudent Money.
Thanks for having me, Bob. How are you?
I am doing great. Listen, it's hard to believe. Of course, you and I have known each other for a very long time. This book is 20 years old. You know, if you rewrote it today, would you do anything differently?
Well, you know, there's certainly things that can be updated, Bob. There's no question about that. But as far as the outline of the book is concerned and the central information that book presents, nothing would change. You know, the essential elements. First of all, the problems that I identify in that book, as far as what the IRS does and how they do it, are still going on today, exactly as they were 20 years ago. You know, one of the core messages of the book is dealing with IRS notices, and I talk about arbitrary notices that the IRS mails out that people don't understand and that the agency doesn't explain, and it's no different today than it ever has been as far as those notices are concerned. So, you know, everything that I talk about in that book is just as valid today as it was 20 years ago.
You know, that's really pretty sad if you think about it. You'd think that there would be...
I was just going to say, I don't know if that's good news or bad news, but you're right. I mean, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, it's bad news because you can't do a updated rewrite. You'd just be writing the same thing. But yeah, you would think that they would adjust things across the board, but doesn't seem to be that way.
No, it doesn't, and that's especially true with regard to penalties. One of the things that I'm most pleased with about that book, Bob, over time, and that is true when the book was released, and that's true today, is my treatment of IRS penalties. I talk about penalties quite at length. I show people how to deal with penalties. I talk about the IRS's obsession with issuing penalties. I talk about the fact that the burden of proof with respect to penalties is on the taxpayer, that you have to prove the penalty doesn't apply. The IRS doesn't have to prove that the penalty does apply. And we have had tremendous success over the years. I mean, tremendous success in getting penalties canceled based on the formulas and strategies that I present in that book.
Well, one of the things I like about the book, and of course all of your writings are this way, is that I think people get really intimidated when they think, that's a big book about the IRS. I'm not going to understand it. You shouldn't think that way at all, because Dan really breaks everything down for you to where you can understand it. And, you know, we've talked about this for so many years, is the fear that comes up when dealing with the IRS. And you mention, or you write about in the book, that there are two great fears. Talk a little bit about what those are and maybe some of the consequences of being that fearful.
Well, one of the fears, of course, is the fear of the unknown. You know, people just don't know what's going to happen next when they get a notice from the IRS. You know, particularly if you're dealing with a tax delinquency situation where you owe the IRS some money. Maybe it's $20,000, maybe it's $200,000. People don't understand how the process works, and they don't know what the next thing is, what the other shoe is that's going to drop when it comes to the IRS. IRS? Can they take my paycheck? Can they take my bank account? Can they seize my car? Can they sell my home? People have all these questions. They don't readily know the answers to the questions, and it causes a great deal of fear. It's a big deal.
There's you write about in the book 4 operating divisions, and there's really 2 that individuals and small business owners should pay attention to. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the two functions that touch more people than anything else when it comes to enforcement is the what they call the examination function. These are the auditors, and then the collection division, and these are the people that collect the taxes. So when you get contacted, and it's important to understand what these functions are, because when you get contacted by the IRS, there is always identifying information in the letter or notice that tells you which function it's coming from, whether it's examination or collection or whatever, and by understanding who you're talking to, you understand what the nature of the challenge is that you're facing, and it puts you in an ideal position then, in the only real solid position to deal with what the IRS is asking for. Let me give you an example. If you get contacted by a tax examiner, an auditor, who says they want to look at your 2022 tax return, at that moment of the conversation, of the interaction, you don't owe the IRS any money. All right, so you don't have to immediately panic and say, "Oh, I owe them this money. What am I going to do?" Well, what money? There isn't even any dollars and cents note indicated on those notices. Generally, at that point in time, you have to understand that your job is to prove that your tax return is correct, and if you can do that, you're not going to owe the IRS any money whatsoever. On the other hand, if you get contacted by the collection division of the IRS, they're not auditing your tax return. All right, you get contacted by the collection division. It's not a matter of producing receipts and canceled checks to show that your tax return is correct. There's an amount of money you owe, and they want the money. And that liability was created either by the fact that you filed a tax return without paying the money that you said you owed, or the IRS conducted an audit at some earlier time. And it's really quite amazing how many people. How often people get those two functions mixed up. And they get the notice from the IRS. They think they have to pay an audit notice. They think they have to pay a bill. That's not true. They get a collection notice that wants money, and they think that they're being audited, and that's not true. So it is important. It is vital to understand what function you're dealing with, because that is going to show you how to best respond.
You talk about notices, how important these notices are, and they come. I mean, the good thing is the IRS tells you in advance what they're going to do, and what's that?
Yeah, go ahead, Bob. I'm sorry.
That's which is a good thing, but to talk about the series of notices and where they fall and what they say and what someone can expect if they owe money.
Well, yeah, let's talk about the collection notices, because those are the ones that cause the most heartburn. Nobody likes going through an audit, but it's one thing to go through an audit and come out not owing any money or owing very little money. It's another thing for the IRS to send you a bill for $75,000 that you owe, right?
Right.
And I'd rather get a bill from the IRS that's bogus, $75,000 bogus bill from the IRS, than to get a $75,000 legitimate bill from the IRS. That's for sure. But the sequence of notices starts very, very simply, and I'm not going to throw out a bunch of notice numbers here because it just gets confusing for people. But there's a series of preliminary notices that the IRS sends out that says, "Hey, you owe us some money. You filed your tax return, or you had this audit, and the bottom line is that you've got a delinquency here. You pay the money." And they give you a date in these preliminary notices, and they say, if you pay by X date, the amount you owe is blank, and that amount has interest calculated to the date on the notice, right? It doesn't mean that the IRS is going to seize and levy and do all these things if you don't pay by that date. I'm talking about the preliminary notices now. Then if there's no response to the preliminary notices, or if the bill is not paid by the time if the bill is not paid in a reasonable period of time, then the IRS will send a final notice of intent to levy, and notice of your right to a hearing. This is a specific letter that the IRS must mail as a matter of law when you have a delinquent liability, they must mail the final notice letter before they can levy anything. All right. Now, the only exception to that is they can take your federal tax refund and offset your federal tax refund. All right. They can do that. But they can't levy a paycheck, a bank account. They can't seize your car, and under no circumstances can they use the administrative power of the IRS to seize your house. All right, that's just completely off the table. Now, that doesn't mean they can't get a house, but they've got a whole different set of procedures they got to go through to do that, and that's, believe me, that's way, way, way down the line. All right, so when a taxpayer gets that final notice of intent to levy, notice of your right to a hearing, you now have 30 days, and the letter will clearly state that you've got 30 days from the date of this letter to either pay the tax in full or exercise your right to what's called a collection due process appeal. If you file a request for a collection due process appeal within that 30-day period of time, the IRS cannot levy anything, all right? The collection process stops, and it stops dead at that point. Now what happens is the case is handed off from the collection function to the appeals office, and the written job description of the appeals office is to negotiate a settlement with the taxpayer. So this is your opportunity to get your case in front of somebody who not only must work out a resolution, almost always they want to work out a resolution. It's their job. They're going to look for a way to resolve the problem, and that's the function that you want to be dealing with. That's the appeals office. That's the third one of the four that people generally interact with. So we got examination, the auditors, collection, the tax collectors, and appeals, and these are the people that want to work out settlements.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. Dan Pilla is my guest, and he's here with us every month to talk everything related to the IRS. Today, we're going back to the basics, talking about what I think is the best book on the IRS. It's called the IRS Problem Solver. And if you want more information on the book, and I've lost count, I always do. I will say 15 books. Am I right?
Yeah, that's close enough.
Tax.
That is correct. A total of 15 books, Bob. Yes.
Yeah, that was a pretty good guess. TaxHelpOnline.com. Just don't write any more because I can only keep up with one number. TaxHelpOnline.com is where you go to get more information. You know, one of the things that always fascinated me about some of the discussions we've had through the years is the amount of incorrect notices that you talk about that come from the IRS to say that you may owe money or whatever the situation is, and it's just not true. And you talk about that so many people will, even though they may even think it's not true, they go ahead and pay it anyway because they don't want to start anything with the IRS. Talk about why that's a mistake.
Well, first of all, it's always a mistake to pay the IRS money you don't owe them. There's no doubt about that. And
right.
People say to themselves, well, I'd rather just send them a check than have a fight with them. But the fact is, when we're dealing with these notices, especially these so-called correction notices, where the IRS mails a letter and says, dear Mr. and Mrs. Smith, we looked at your tax return for the year 2021, and we found a mistake. Don't worry, we fixed it. We fixed the mistake. Now you owe us $3,275. Please send a check. And people will look at the notice, and the notice doesn't clearly explain. Even though the law requires, Bob, that the notice explain where this liability came from, these so-called correction notices very often do not explain where the adjustments came from. So you can't look at the notice and make an intelligent decision whether the IRS is right or wrong. All right, if you had a tax professional prepare your return, you're probably going to sit down with the tax pro and say, "What the heck's going on here?" And the pro is going to look at the letter and say, "Well, I don't see what they're talking about. They don't clearly explain the notice." You might call the IRS and you're not going to get any information from the IRS over the phone. They're just going to tell you what the account records show. Well, the account records show you owe $3,275, so send us a check. So you're not getting clear resolution. And what the notices likewise don't tell you is how to respond when you disagree. All right, so these correction notices, they carry a response time, and that response time, generally speaking, is 60 days. So if you respond in writing to the notice within 60 days by telling the IRS that you disagree with their calculation. All right, I believe you're wrong. You disagree with the calculation, and that's the answer you want to give 100% of the time if they don't clearly explain what the error is. All right, just tell them you disagree with it, because that puts the ball back in their court, and now they are required by law. And the book shows you exactly how to write the letter and the language to use, but they are now required by law to abate that tax liability. That is to say, cancel it out as if it never existed. And if they believe you owe the money, now they have to go to the next step and issue what's called a notice of deficiency. A notice of deficiency is a final determination from the IRS that you owe money, and the notice of deficiency, Bob, is very, very specific as to why they think you owe the money. So now you got your notice of deficiency. If the IRS issues the notice of deficiency, now you got a notice of deficiency in hand, and you have the opportunity to go through it and make an intelligent decision whether you owe the money or not. If you owe the money, you pay it. All right, problem solved. If you don't owe the money, you've got a secondary appeal procedure available to you, where you can go to the United States Tax Court, and it's really not a complicated process, right? It's a $60 filing fee to get a small case in the United States Tax Court, which is the small tax case is kind of the Judge Wapner of the U.S. Tax Court. It's a very simplified process, and now you're going to have an opportunity to sit down with an appeals officer. Remember, I mentioned the appeals people trying to work out resolutions. All right, so now you're going to sit down with an appeals officer, and they're going to work through to figure out whether you really owe this money or not. And so this is the process, which is very simple to follow. It's inexpensive. In most cases, it just costs a postage stamp to get this done. And now you're going to have an opportunity to sit down with somebody at the IRS who is trained to make a correct decision based on the facts and the law of your case without just running you over. So why would anybody ever just write a check if you don't believe that you absolutely owe the money?
You know, of course, the IRS is by far perfect, and there's a lot of things that need to be fixed. But there's a theme, though, that kind of goes through a lot of the information that you give out of this book, and it is that there is a process. And I think that's one of the things that taxpayers forget, is that there's a really good process for a lot of things to get some of these problems cleared up.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And what that does, Bob, when you understand the process, is it debunks the common misperception that the IRS can just do anything it wants, anytime it wants. It cannot do that. All right, the agency's got to follow the procedures. You as the taxpayer, of course, have to follow the procedures as well. But the IRS has got to follow very, very specific steps. All right, when we're talking about getting an assessment of tax liability against you, they got very specific steps they have to follow that are called the deficiency procedures that end up with this notice of deficiency that I just talked about a minute ago that gives you an opportunity to appeal to the tax court if you believe it's wrong. All right, if they don't follow the deficiency procedures very specifically in getting the assessment is invalid. You don't owe them you don't owe money to the IRS just because they say you owe them money. You owe them money if they follow the procedures correctly, and at the end of the line, it's determined that you in fact owe. Now is when you owe the money. Same thing as with collection. If they just send you a notice and say you owe us this money, all right, they have to follow the very specific collection procedures to collect that money, to enforce collection of that money. And if they don't follow those procedures, any actions they take are invalid. All right. On the other hand, when you understand the process and you're walking through those collection procedures along with the IRS properly, you're going to get your case in front of the appeals office and maybe even the tax court in a collection situation, depending on where you're at and what arguments you're making, to make sure that you pay the money on your terms, not theirs, that they don't run you over in the process of collecting.
This is Bob Brooks, and I'm talking to Dan Pilla today. We're kind of going back to the basics and talking about his great book called The IRS Problem Solver. And I always like to read this quote because it's also one of my favorites. It says, Dan Pilla probably knows more about the IRS than the commissioner of the IRS. His work is the final word on IRS issues, Associated Press. The name of the book, The IRS Problem Solver. If you want more information, taxhelponline.com is where you would go. Is it safe to say that you have a favorite form in dealing with the IRS?
A favorite tax form?
Yes, a favorite form.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's funny. And Bob, I've done over 6,000 radio interviews in my life, and I think 1,000 of them has been with you.
Yes, probably.
It may be. And nobody's ever asked me that question. What is my favorite tax form? And I'll tell you what my favorite tax form is. It's IRS Form 12153. 12153. It's called a request for a collection due process hearing. All right? That is the form that every taxpayer in America needs to know about. And not everyone is going to use that form, but you need to have that form at the ready in case you do need it. And that is the form that allows you to file an appeal of IRS collection action. All right? When you file the appeal of IRS collection action, your case is taken out of the hands of the collection function. These are the people that lien and levy and seize assets. The case is put into the hands of the appeals office. As I said a minute ago, the written job description of the appeals office is to negotiate a settlement with the taxpayer, all right? And the appeals office has an affirmative duty, Bob, in all collection due process cases to verify, all right? They have to independently verify, so the burden of proof is not on the taxpayer here in this regard. The burden is on the appeals office. They have to independently verify that the IRS followed all applicable laws and administrative procedures in getting the assessment in the first place. So in other words, the appeals office must verify that the IRS got their assessment properly by following the applicable rules and procedures. So this is the place you want to be in any kind of a collection situation. You get there by filing Form 12153 within the proper time frames and based on the facts of your case.
You know, I thought you were going to say the use of a document called the affidavit.
Well, yeah, the affidavit is very, very important as well. But in all fairness, that's not an IRS form, right?
Yeah, true.
You asked
that's
me
true.
about an IRS form. So now the affidavit is critical, Bob. You're exactly right, and it's critical to presenting evidence to the IRS. An affidavit is nothing more than a detailed letter of explanation that you have notarized, and by notarizing that statement, it becomes a sworn statement. You use an affidavit as the means of presenting testimony to the IRS on a particular issue. If the IRS says you didn't file a tax return and you claim that you did file it, your affidavit can help you establish that. If the IRS is doing an audit and they're disallowing expenses because you don't have records or your records are incomplete, then you can use an affidavit to fill in the gaps. If we're talking about a collection situation and you're maintaining that you've got special circumstances that the IRS must consider in backing off of enforced collection, then you use an affidavit to present those special circumstances. So that affidavit is used in just about every kind of interaction with the IRS, and so it is vital to understand how that works.
Once again, the name of the book is the IRS Problem Solver, and you can get more information on Dan and the 15 books that he's written at taxhelponline.com. Dan, always great to talk to you. We'll be talking to you next month.
All right, I'll look forward to it, Bob.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. I've had the blessing of interviewing him for probably about 22 years and just full of great information. Once again, taxhelponline.com is the name of the site. If you have a question for me, please go to the website at prudentmoney.com and send it in because we are all out of time. Till we do meet again next time, keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.